These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. White to move. What is the best move? The tension is high anytime the queens are faced off against each other, as they are here. Each side looks at how the opposite queen is guarded, asking whether the guard might be undermined or whether there is a way to exploit its required attendance by the queen's side. In this case, black's queen is guarded by the knight on e5. White can't take the knight, but that isn't the point. The point is that the knight can't afford to leave its square, and thus that white can play his only check, 1. Knight moves to c6, check. With impunity. Black replies king moves to b7. Other king moves are possible, but this one seems most attractive as it puts some heat on white's knight. Now ask, why doesn't black instead play rook takes knight, with either rook? The answer is that when white played knight moves to c6 he unmasked the threat of bishop takes knight, which would destroy the guard of black's queen. If black tries rook takes knight, white thus has bishop takes knight, check. And since it's a check, a crucial point, black would have to spend time moving his king. White then has queen takes queen. Replying to 1. Knight moves to c6 with king moves to b7 means that if white plays bishop takes knight it won't give check and so won't be nearly as dangerous. Alright, think of the position resulting from 1. Knight moves to c6, check. King moves to b7 as a little adjustment of the board white can force at no cost. What would then be possible? Since your knight is in the picture you should be thinking about forks and c2. Knight moves to e7, attacking both black rooks. This sounds good, but now wait. 2 knight moves to e7 is not a check, so it gives black time to make any move he likes. The danger is not that he will play queen takes queen, for then white replies end pawn from c1 takes queen and the fork still hangs over black's head. No, the problem is that black will reply to knight moves to e7 with rook takes knight c1 plus, a crushing riposte, for now black is the one who has destroyed the only guard of white's queen and has done it with check. After white plays rook takes rook, black has queen takes queen. So too. Knight moves to e7 doesn't look so good for white after all. Yet white can rehabilitate the idea by pausing to play queen takes queen on his second move, then playing 3. Knight moves to e7. Now if black plays rook takes knight c1 it doesn't matter. White recaptures and wins the exchange. Black still has an idea. Remember that after 1. Knight moves to c6, check. King moves to b7, 2. Queen takes queen, knight takes queen, 3. Knight moves to e7, the fork, black now has a knight on g4. He, too, thus has a knight fork to offer of white's 2 rooks, knight moves to f2. Thus it can go 3. Knight moves to e7, knight moves to f2 but then white plays 4. Knight takes rook g6, and after 4. Knight takes rook, 5. Rook takes knight, white has won material. Black's rook was loose, white's rook wasn't. Okay, but now suppose it goes 3. Knight moves to e7, rook moves to e6, 4. Knight takes rook c8, knight moves to f2. This way black is hoping to take one of white's rooks and then capture the knight on c8. But this doesn't work either, for now white has 5. Knight takes bishop b6 and he still wins a piece. So black is better off losing the exchange as described at the end of the previous paragraph. You need to see these variations, though, as they might have ruined everything. The point to remember is that when either or both sides are moving their knights around, you have to keep asking about the next capture or fork the pieces can give from their new squares. And when you're operating without checks, as white largely is here, it makes life complicated. You have to keep asking what counter threats the enemy could make elsewhere. This position is full of other useful lessons, large and small. Start with the small. Looking back now, you can see that the knight on e5 was overworked. It guarded black's queen and also the c6 square, which white was able to use as a springboard for a double attack with his knight. Second, the layout of black's rooks here is worth a stare. They are nicely arranged for a knight fork. But the most important lesson here involves move order. It all works for white so long as he liquidates the queens at precisely the right moment, neither too soon nor too late. He doesn't do it on the first move because keeping the black queen on the board also keeps the black knight where it is. He doesn't wait until the third move because then black has time to turn the tables. He does it on the second move, after the black queen's presence has fulfilled the useful, to white, purpose of freezing the e5 knight long enough for white to play knight moves to c6, check. A final way to state the key point: notice that the safety of each queen from the other is the paramount consideration at every turn. If either party is able to capture the guard of the enemy queen and do it with check, he will win the queen and the game. In the end neither side loses a queen, they merely are traded, but the pressures created for each by the need to avoid that result dictates much of the other tactical operations. It is the reason why black's first reply is not rook takes knight c6, and it is the reason why white's second move must not be knight moves to e7. Black to move. What is the best move? Attacking the guard. Introduction. Sometimes it isn't feasible to capture or overwork an enemy piece that impedes your plans. There remain other ways to get rid of such a piece, one of which is to threaten it and thus force it to move. When we speak of attacking the guard, this is what we mean, not capturing it, but aiming a piece at it with the threat of a capture. This technique tends to work best when the guardian is a king or queen, since their high value typically gives them no choice but to flee an attack and thus abandon their defensive duties. Just beefing up their protection is not an option. But lesser pieces also may find it necessary to flee a threat if they're loose or worth less than the piece that threatens them. Or in other cases the attacked piece may not flee, instead it may capture your attacker, and this may be much to your liking indeed. It may be your intention if it means something else has been left loose in the meantime. Getting rid of a guard by attacking it can be complicated, and the hard positions in this section are among the most demanding in the book. The reason is that when you attack a piece other than the king you are not forcing your opponent's reply in the same way you do by making a capture or check. You have taken nothing from him, so he may have plenty of reply options to consider: a counter threat, a check, or a move of the attacked piece that takes it out of danger and still enables it to perform guard duty. These possibilities all have to be considered when you make a threat, but sometimes they can be cut down by using threats that have other good things going for them as well. For example, threats that also give check or fork another piece. We will start with attacks on the king when it guards one of its pieces, since these are the easiest to understand and use. Then we will look at the more difficult problem of chasing away a queen that guards a piece or mating square. Later we will consider attacks on lesser pieces. Checks to drive the king away from guard duty. A piece protected by its king is a vulnerability. The king can only provide protection so long as it is right next to the piece it guards, and in response to an attack the king often has to move since adding defenders to it is no help. So when you see a piece so protected, it's especially useful to look for any checks you can give. Whatever else they do, the checks may leave loose whatever the king meant to guard. Turn to the position on the left. Question 1. What does black attack? Answer: white's rook, nothing more. Question 2. What guards white's rook, preventing rook takes rook? Answer: white's king. Question 3. Can white's king be checked and thus driven away from the rook, leaving it loose? Answer: yes, with bishop moves to d3, check. The king moves to g1, and now black wins the rook with rook takes rook, check. On second thought, however, don't jump to the conclusion that a check will force the king to move. Consider whether your opponent has other options. Here white also would have the option of rook moves to e2, blocking the check with his rook. But now the rook would be attacked twice and still defended just once, so black again wins it with rook takes rook. Black's initial bishop moves to d3, check. Thus works fine, but we'll want to stay in the habit of looking at all of an enemy's possible replies to threats like this. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's king threatens white's rook. What guards the rook? White's king. Can black check white's king and thus drive it away? Yes, with rook moves to h4, check. White has to move his king back to the third rank, leaving his rook loose and thus permitting black to play king takes rook. But wait, what if white instead replies to rook moves to h4, check? By interposing with rook moves to g4? Then the rook is attacked twice and protected once, and is lost but only because of the bishop on e6, which thus is essential to make the sequence work. White to move. What is the best move? White's rook attacks black's bishop. What guards the bishop? Black's king. Does white have any checks that will force the king to move? Yes, if you remember to consider the work your pawns can do as well as your pieces, and if you bear in mind the pawn's ability to change files by capturing. White plays pawn from g4 takes at f5, check. And now black must move his king. He can take white's pawn with it, or he can move the king elsewhere, but in no event can he prevent white from winning the bishop with rook takes bishop next move. White to move. What is the best move? White attacks nothing as yet, but he does see that the knight on f6 is protected only by its king. This alone is suggestive, so he experiments with any checks he can give. There is just one. Queen moves to e7, check. It attacks the knight and checks the king, forcing it away to the 8th rank or to h6. Now white wins the knight with queen takes knight. The key: remember that any piece drawing protection from its king is a potential target, whether or not it currently is under attack. Simple checks may leave it loose. White to move. What is the best move? A variation on the same theme. Again white attacks nothing, and again he looks for any checks he can give, perhaps noticing this time that the knight on f6 is loose. His possible checks are 2, queen moves to e8, which loses the queen right away to black's knight or rook, and queen moves to e6, which is far more interesting because it is safe and forces the king to move. Naturally black will want to move the king in a way that allows it to protect his knight, which white is poised to capture, so black tries king moves to g7. But now we are back in the familiar position where an enemy piece is guarded by its king. What to do? Give another check. White plays queen moves to e7, check. And now the king is forced to the back rank or to h6. Either way, white takes the knight next move. There are 2 points to take away here. One is that the same piece may be able to both give check and take a piece that the king protects once the king moves. The other is that sometimes more than one check is necessary to create the needed arrangement. White to move. What is the best move? You have a queen and rook nicely coordinated on f8, but black guards the square twice, 2. Still, imagine playing these things through to see what results. Your first thought might be 1. Rook moves to f8, check. Queen takes rook. If black instead moves his king, he loses his queen, 2. Queen takes queen, check. King takes queen losing a rook. But now pause after the first pair of moves. The queens would then be faced off against each other, and the only guard of black's queen would be his king. If you could give a check, you might be able to pry the king away and leave the queen exposed to capture. You have a tool for the purpose in your light squared bishop. 2. Bishop moves to d5, check. If black moves his king to king moves to h8, 3. Queen takes queen nets a queen for a rook. You might think black could do better by instead blocking the bishop check with queen moves to f7, then play goes 3. Bishop takes queen, king takes bishop, and black seems to have taken another white piece in compensation for his queen. But be resolute in considering how the board would look at the end of any such sequence, and especially in looking for any fork that might then be executed as a kicker. In this case black's king would be left on f7, so white looks for checks against the king on its new square or any loose black pieces to attack, and finds queen moves to f4, check. Winning the rook that is stranded on e3. White ends up with a queen against black's bishop and an easily won game. These possibilities will repay some review. A lesson of them is to take care against rushing through an imagined sequence and automatically assuming that after 1. Rook moves to f8, check. Queen takes rook must come the natural recapture 2. Queen takes queen, king takes queen. Throwing an in-between move, or Zwischenzug, into the sequence, 2. Bishop moves to d5, check. Turns it from a loser into a winner. White to move. What is the best move? You're making progress if you realize that in this position you have to consider 1. Queen moves to e7, check. Sure, it looks suicidal, after 1. Queen takes queen, 2. Rook takes queen, king takes rook. You would have given away a rook. But a less hurried view of the sequence is needed, and an application of the principle shown in the previous frame. After the first step, 1. Queen moves to e7, check. Queen takes queen. Don't mechanically imagine yourself recapturing black's queen. Pause and consider the board after just those steps, and see that black's queen would then be attacked once by your rook and protected just once by black's king. A king is a poor guard for an enemy piece because an attack so easily drives it away. What checks would white have here? 2. Bishop takes bishop, check. Black's only legal move is to interpose his queen at e6, then white has 3. Rook takes queen and has won a piece. Another way to see this would be to observe from the start that white has the option of bishop takes bishop, check. And that only black's queen on d7 prevents it. Then look at your checks and see queen moves to e7, check. Forking black's king and queen and requiring him to play queen takes queen. You realize that black's queen is overworked, and that after the sequence just described his bishop would be left loose. Giving up your queen to win the bishop wouldn't make sense, but then you see that bishop takes bishop is a check that wins back your queen after all and leaves you a piece to the good. White to move. What is the best move? Black's queen is under attack indeed, it is pinned. If its guard were driven away it might be taken. White looks for checks he can give and takes full advantage of the pin on Black's queen by putting a rook and prize to it. Rook moves to e7, check. Must the king move? No, Black can play rook takes rook. But the joy of doubled rooks, as White has here, is that one can replace the other. Now White replies rook takes rook, check. And this time moving the king is Black's only recourse. Wherever it goes, White has queen takes queen. White to move. What is the best move? Again White has his rooks arranged in a battery along a file while Black's are connected on the back rank. But this time the use White makes of the pattern is different, for it is Black's rook on e8 that is under attack but protected by his king. True, it also is protected by the a8 rook, but then again, White attacks it twice. White thus begins with rook takes rook, check. His only check, for those who keep track of these things. Black's reply is forced, rook takes rook. And now White has replaced a black rook protected by two pieces with a rook protected only by its king and which he still attacks. All that remains is to drive the king away with a check. Since White has vacated his rook from e5, the way is clear for him to play bishop moves to d6, check. The king moves to g8, leaving the rook on e8 loose. White takes it with rook takes rook, check. Lesson: when an enemy target is guarded by its king and another piece, try to get rid of the other guard so that only the king is left, for then a check may be usable to drive it away. Getting rid of the other guard may be a matter of attacking it directly, or as in this case it may be a matter of taking the target and allowing a recapture by a piece that ends up with only the king as a defender. Incidentally, if you were looking for a way to blunder here, a natural method would be to focus too much on the idea of liquidating the rooks, as White you might imagine 1. Rook takes rook, 2. Rook takes rook, king takes rook, and then you seem to be out of options. Our familiar point repeats: when you imagine even a short sequence, don't forget the possibility of usefully inserting checks into the middle of it. White to move. What is the best move? You see that black's bishop attacks your rook. Before moving anything, though, think about offense, e.g., captures you can make. Your rook attacks black's rook, which is guarded only by its king. Mission: drive black's king away so the rook on d8 is left loose. What tools do you have for this purpose? For openers, you have a knight that can give check. Think about knight moves to f6, check. If black moves his king, he loses his rook, so naturally he instead would prefer to play pawn from e7 takes knight. This appears to ruin your idea, but not so fast. That check and capture would have had significant consequences, removing the black king's pawn cover on the e-file. Remember the mission, and consider checks you then would have, that wouldn't require moving the d5 rook from its file. There is one left, our pawn from h1 moves to e1, check. This time black has no choice but to move his king and forfeit his rook. White wins the exchange. Since he operated solely with checks, black never was able to play bishop takes rook. Again we see that it may take multiple checks, whether with the same piece or successive pieces, to force the king away from its protectorate. Don't give up on such a possibility too easily. For an additional little illustration of the same principle, imagine this same position with the g2 pawn off the board. Then after 1. Knight moves to f6, check. Pawn from e7 takes knight, 2. Rook moves to e1, check. King moves to f8, white has 3. Rook takes rook, check. King moves to g7 and then our pawn from e1 moves to g1, check. Forcing the black king away from the h8 rook and allowing it, 2, to be taken. White to move. What is the best move? What does white attack? Black's rook, which he could take with his king if it weren't protected by the pawn on f7. So turn your attention to the pawn. What can you do to it? Capture it. Bishop takes at f7. Of course black recaptures king takes bishop, but white has made the rook much more vulnerable by converting its guard from a sturdy pawn into an easily frightened king. Now it's a matter of driving off the king with checks by white's queen, and remember that it may take more than one check to accomplish the purpose. White starts with queen moves to d7, check. Black resists the invitation to abandon the rook, and so plays king moves to f6. Now white adds another check, queen moves to d6, check. Black has to move his king to f7 or g7. Now notice that while black's king still protects the rook, white's queen now attacks the rook a second time. White plays queen takes rook, check. And black is unable to recapture because white's queen has protection from its king. The position is a fitting conclusion to this subsection because it involves several of the ideas we have considered here. First, an exchange is performed so that a piece white attacks ends up protected only by its king. Then two checks are used to manipulate the king's position. Finally, the same piece that administers the checks also is used to take the target. Black to move. What is the best move? Flush checks, the decoy. Sometimes the purpose of a check is not to drive the enemy king away from its protectorate, but rather to draw it away by forcing it to capture the piece you have used to attack it. This procedure is known as a decoy. It necessarily involves a sacrifice, often of a rook, and so is most often used to enable the capture of an enemy queen, but we will see other uses of the principle as well. The logic of the move and the means of searching for it really are no different than before. You still are looking for checks that will move the enemy king away from a piece that it guards. It's just that this time the check is given by a piece that you plant flush against the king, with or without a capture. In prior parts of the series we have considered these checks interchangeably with others. We are examining them separately here because our focus now is solely on ways of removing the guard, and decoys checks that invite the king to capture are a common and important technique for this purpose worthy of a few moments of undivided attention. The position to the left is a simple example. What does black threaten? His queen attacks white's queen, which in turn is protected by its king. A piece protected by its king invites consideration of a check to drive the king away, and when the protected piece is a queen, the prospect of capturing justifies a flush check that allows the king to capture the threatening piece. Here black has the most common resource for such a purpose, a rook, which he plays to h1. White's forced reply is king takes rook leaving his queen loose, and losing it to queen takes queen next move. White to move. What is the best move? What does white threaten? His queen attacks black's queen, which in turn is protected by its king. The prospect of winning the queen justifies not only a check but a check sacrifice by white. He plays rook moves to e7, check, sticking his rook flush against black's king. Black plays king takes rook, but in capturing white's rook, black leaves his queen loose and loses it to queen takes queen, check. The position is essentially symmetrical. If it were black's turn to move, he would win using the same method. Incidentally, you might think that if black's king declines to capture the white rook and instead moves out of its way, say, to d6, black's queen is then lost to rook takes queen a skewer. But the result is worse than that. White plays queen takes queen, check, and mates a move later. Black's king is forced to c6, then rook moves to c7 mates. The result is similar if black moves his king to f6, 2 queen takes queen, check. King moves to g6, forced, 3. Rook moves to g7, check. King moves to h5, 4. Queen takes at g5, checkmate. Consider this a reminder not to forget that chances to mate may arise unexpectedly and mustn't be overlooked. These first two positions have notable points in common. Both involve an enemy king and queen adjacent to one another with the former protecting the latter. Both involve an attack by your queen on the enemy queen. Both involve the sacrifice of a rook by sticking it next to the enemy king, forcing the king to capture and thus drawing it away from the queen a decoy. These features constitute a common pattern that we will see in various forms several more times. White to move. What is the best move? All the ingredients just mentioned are in place again here. Find them and the solution is simple. White gives the flush check, rook moves to g7, check. Forcing black to play king takes rook, otherwise his queen gets skewered. Then white plays queen takes queen, check. The point, when you see the enemy king guarding one of its pieces, think about a check to drive it away, and be sure to include a look for check sacrifices that will draw the king out of position by making it capture away from the queen. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's queen is loose and under attack by white. He could move his queen or protect it easily enough, but instead he observes that white's queen is guarded only by its king. If black can give a check that forces white to put some distance between his king and queen, black will be the one to play queen takes queen. Thus black plays rook moves to g1, check. Requiring white to play king takes rook, a decoy of the king onto a square from which it can't reach the queen. Black takes the queen next move. Black to move. What is the best move? Now a defensive study involving the same principles. Black finds himself in check. He has two choices, move his king or interpose his queen on f7. Which is preferable? Picture the interposition and ask what white's next move would be. One way to answer the question is to ask what checks white could give, and with what consequences. Another is to look for any patterns in the position black would have created with his move. Either way you reach the same conclusion, black's queen will be under attack and protected only by its king. A standard flush check by white, rook takes at h7, will force black to play king takes rook, then allowing queen takes queen, check. By white and winning him a queen for a rook. So queen moves to f7 isn't the answer for black. The result illustrates a general danger in interpositions that block a check but cause the interposing piece, especially the queen, to be guarded only by its king. For the sake of completeness, let's briefly consider what black should play if he instead is to move his king. King moves to h8 causes black to be mated on the spot, of course, with queen takes at h7. King moves to g8 results in queen takes at h7, check. Losing a pawn. King moves to f8 is better, but why? Because now if white plays rook takes at h7 or queen takes at h7, he doesn't give check, and this gives black time to take white's pawn on f2. Indeed, if white is really careless, he can take the h7 pawn with his queen and then get mated. Moving his queen into such poor defensive position leaves his king in jeopardy. 1. King moves to f8, 2. Queen takes at h7, queen takes at f2, check. And now black has seized initiative and never lets go. 3 king moves to h3, queen moves to f5, check. 4. Pawn from g3 moves to g4, interposing, rook moves to a3, check. 5. King moves to h4, queen moves to f6, check. 6. Pawn from g4 moves to g5, queen moves to f4, checkmate. Or 5. King moves to g2, queen moves to c2, check. 6. King moves to g1, rook moves to a1, checkmate. So in reply to black's king moves to f8, white has no immediate way to win anything. Of course black must be careful to keep his king where it can't be the subject of a fork that costs him the loose rook on a2. Black to move. What is the best move? Back to first principles, what does black attack? His rook attacks white's rook on f2, which is guarded only by its king. Black can't drive the king away with a check, but he looks for any check he can give and does find one in rook takes at d3, check. It loses the rook but draws the king away from the f2 rook, which black takes a move later. Black wins a pawn. The point, a check sacrifice with a rook is most profitable when it enables you to take an enemy queen that had been protected by its king, but it still may enable you to turn a smaller profit when the king protects one of its rooks. White to move. What is the best move? Black's king and queen are adjacent, and sometimes when this is so, a check or two can arrange the pieces for an easy removal of the guard. So white experiments with checks and finds queen takes at b4, check. The challenge for black now is to move his king without then losing his queen to a skewer. His first thought might be king moves to e3, permitting the king to keep guarding the queen. If so, white uses our now standard technique for removing a king as a defender. He throws another check at it with rook moves to c3, check. The king can't move up, it can only move down to e2, leaving the black queen loose and doomed. The same basic result follows if black instead replies to queen takes at b4, check. By moving his king up to e5, white adds another check, rook moves to c5, check, and drives off the king, permitting queen takes queen next move. Finally, suppose black responds to white's queen takes at b4, check. With king moves to f5. Now white sees a classic opening for a flush check with rook moves to f6, check. Drawing the king away from the queen by calling for king takes rook and thus permitting white to play queen takes queen, check. On his next move, and queen takes knight a move later. White to move. What is the best move? White almost seems able to mate with queen moves to e8, but not quite, the king can escape. So he experiments with other checks, and after seeing that the knight on d7 is pinned, he plays queen moves to b6, check. Now notice that since black has no safe place to move his king, he must interpose something, and his only option is queen moves to c7. Suddenly we have the familiar pattern now under examination: white's queen attacks black's, which in turn is guarded only by its king. As soon as the pattern comes into view, look for an additional check to try to loosen black's queen. This naturally leads to 2. Rook moves to e8, check. King takes rook, 3. Queen takes queen, and then white takes black's bishop or knight. Next move. Black to move. What is the best move? Decoys on the diagonal, bishop check sacrifices. The decoys, or flush checks, considered in the previous set of positions were administered by rooks. But bishops can do it, too. In the position to the left, some elements familiar from our last batch of studies are visible: white's king protects its queen, and the queen is under attack by its opposite number. This makes you want to check the king to pull it away and leave white's queen loose. You have no rook available for the purpose, but consider all of your options and you find that you do have a bishop. Black plays bishop moves to c2, check. And the consequence of the check is the same as if it were administered by a rook: the king must capture or else allow the queen to be skewered. White plays king takes bishop, at least picking up the bishop before leaving his queen loose and permitting black to play queen takes queen, check. Next move. White to move. What is the best move? You have a possible capture in rook takes rook. To make it profitable you would need to eliminate the black rooks guard the king. This you do with a check. Bishop moves to b3, check. Doesn't work, of course, because black can interpose a pawn on c4. But bishop moves to h7, check. Requires black to move his king, and when he plays king takes bishop it drags his king away from the rook on f8. Now white has rook takes rook, winning the exchange. If it's black's turn to move, he does the same thing. Notice that since only the bishop is being sacrificed for the sake of the decoy, the range of targets that makes the sacrifice worthwhile is a little larger than it was when a rook had to be thrown away. White to move. What is the best move? The pattern here is structurally the same as the others just seen in this chapter but looks a little different. The initial cue is that the two queens are faced off against each other. If one becomes loose, the other takes it. Although black's queen seems surrounded by pieces, in fact it is guarded only by its king and thus is highly vulnerable. The next thought is to check the king and force it to move despite its apparent insulation. Surveying his pieces, white does find one check usable for the purpose. His bishop can take black's f7 pawn. Indeed, bishop takes at f7, check. Is a classic sacrifice to force the king to move. f7 often is a weak square before a king castle's weak because only the king protects it. In reply black's only legal move is king takes bishop. Now white plays queen takes queen, winning a queen and pawn for his bishop. Black to move. What is the best move? Now let's move the same idea back a step. White has just played knight takes knight c6, now black must decide how to recapture. Which pawn should he use for the purpose, b7 or d7? If he uses the one on d7, his queen is exposed, the two queens would be aimed at each other. True, black's queen would be protected. But the protection is from black's king, and the position here would then resemble the previous one. White plays bishop takes at f7, check. Black would have to play king takes bishop, or at least move his king to f8, queen takes queen follows for white. So in the initial position black should recapture with his b7 pawn instead. Lesson: exposing a piece because it seems safely protected by its king can be risky business. Can be, though of course it all depends on the details. If black's e7 pawn were instead on e6, for example, leaving his queen exposed wouldn't be so risky after all. White's bishop wouldn't be able to capture on f7. Morals like the one just drawn refer to risks to consider, not rules to obey.